On more light talk, I think we can make a playlist out of these light discussions that we've had ever since I bought this Cobb light. I have been thinking a lot about my confidence approaching correct versus right exposure. I figured we could just discuss like the technicalities of exposure anyway, the SBR situation, the latitude of exposure, the whole thing. But I've noticed I don't have much confidence in right exposure. Like I'm always doing correct exposure because whenever I think I want this to be dark, I want this to be bright, I'm always worried that I'm overexposing something or like I'm damaging the recoverability of the image, which is why I'm always kind of opting for correct exposure. It's a bit of a fallback, if that makes sense. How do you expose for darkness or expose for a bright scene confidently, knowing that you're not damaging the recoverability of the image, if that makes sense?
So I think there are, as always, I mean, this should be like a TM, multiple questions in one.
Good stuff. Glad to hear it.
What's the purpose of recoverability?
My perspective is that if it's recoverable, it just doesn't look hideous. You know, like nothing's blown out. If I decide I don't want to be particularly dark or I don't want to be particularly bright, I can change that in post. Which I suppose kind of like links back to like how much of my vision should I have during production, but like that's a whole different can of worms. Am I on the right track, do you think?
I understand where that comes from. However, I do think that is limiting.
So I just literally touched my camera and the USB input just broke.
So no recoverability there.
No recoverability there at all. Can't color grade that to be fixed. That's terrible.
Trying to explain recoverability to my current students, we ended up calling it capability.
Ah, okay.
So it's a kind of cover your ass.
Right. That's what I'm thinking. How do I expose for darkness, for brightness? How do I make an image particularly dark, particularly bright? You know, right exposure, emotional exposure. How do I pull that off while also covering my ass?
Well, I think at a certain point, you want the confidence to not have to worry so much about covering your ass.
Right. I see. That's a shame.
This is where knowledge is going to be your friend. Knowledge is going to be your... how much can I break this?
I'm trying to think of a...
Knowledge is going to be your light in the dark.
Because we're talking about lights. That's a good one.
When you did your over-under, I think this is one benefit of the over-under test where beginners kind of like don't see what's right in front of them. Doing multiple over-under tests over time should hopefully start giving you a library of what different exposures away from correct exposure look and feel like.
Ah, okay.
So as you go through your overs and unders, start like, at least mentally, if not actually on paper, start building a little database of going, what kind of mood and tone, what kind of scene can I see myself using +1 for? What kind of mood and tone and scene, what kind of location, what kind of time of day can I see myself using 1 under or 2 under for?
What I'm hearing is I need to do more over-under tests. As usual, I assume. It's not like a very, very regular labor.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
So let me just give you an example, right? So I'm just going to randomly play with... I haven't actually measured this. This is one of those like do as I say, don't do as I do, because I've eyeballed my exposure here. But if you look at this now, I would say this is kind of my middle in the road where I'm sitting right now in terms of exposure. So if we go 1 under, 1, 2, 3, that would be 1 under.
Yeah, that gives me more of a like dark room looking at a laptop type of vibe.
I'm looking at a laptop.
Hey!
Like I'm actually
look at that.
looking
We've
at a
perfectly
laptop.
recreated your circumstances. It's good work. That's great. So the first one kind of feels like a morning light or like a lamppost shining through a room, whereas I feel like that.
That's a third under. That's
your
2/3 under. That's a stop under.
Your full stop up felt like a source coming in from like a window or something, whereas the one that's a stop under feels like a source that's in the room, like a really small and weak one, like a laptop or a lamp or something.
So that's a third over. That then would be 2/3 over. And I can't go, with my current settings, I can't go all the way. So I think that's the starting point. Build that library.
Okay. Should I build that library with a camera that I know I'm going to use? Like, should I nick my friend's Blackmagic and try and do overrunners on that instead?
I think your own DSLR is certainly a good starting point, just to start developing that mental library. Now, there are going to be some differences, but, like until you get to the extremes of the exposure latitude or to the extremes of the dynamic range, you aren't going to see that many differences.
Right. Okay.
Now, where exposure gets tricky is that image brightness isn't just dependent on exposure, it's also dependent on subject.
Okay.
So if I have exactly the same exposure settings in camera and I do that,
I see what you mean. Yeah. Okay. That's fair enough.
image has gone darker, right?
Yeah.
But I haven't changed any camera settings.
No.
Which means that in terms of using in-camera exposure tools, and in terms of building this library, we need a constant reference. We need constant reference subjects, because if I take the same image now and do this, you were to look at this in a histogram and I do that, you're going to get one big spike on the left, right?
Yeah.
Because every pixel in the image is really dark.
Yeah.
However, if I do this, you're going to get a much bigger spike on the right.
Yeah.
I haven't changed any settings in camera. Probably a good example is if we do this again and we were to read that on a histogram, it's going to have a big spike on the right.
Mm-hmm.
Without changing camera, without changing the light, and I do this, everything's gotten a lot darker. That's not because the light has changed. It's not because the camera exposure settings have changed, but it's because the subjects have changed.
This is like how a lot of the time in some episodes we've got like a light side, dark side thing happening, because I'm normally wearing bright clothing. My room's walls are white, your room's walls are beige, and you're normally wearing dark clothing. The exposure is probably quite similar, but the subjects are different.
So when you think about it then, like if you want to build this library, then you want to also make sure that you have a constant test scene, so that you see how the actual exposure changes the appearance. If you shoot these exposures with wildly different subject in front of the camera, then it's going to take a lot longer to develop that eye. You will eventually, but it's going to take a much longer to build that mental muscle memory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because there's no consistency, so I can't really isolate trends.
So I think for me, where I would start is to get a much better instinctive feel for what does +1 look like, what does -1 look like, what does -2 look like.
Okay. And I should probably start doing this on myself now that I have my light, because I've always been doing them with the last one that I did, which I still haven't posted because I hate, with one I did with like the Ken doll with my IKEA lamp. Didn't like it. And with my light, I could also adjust the light as well. I can't, like, it won't just be restricted entirely to in-camera settings, which I think is nice. So I can do one for like a test for f-stop and a test for the actual dimmer on the light and see how the range differs.
You've got a lot less range on that dimmer than you think.
Oh, well,
so let's
I guess I'll figure out what my range is when I do the test.
I had a little thought just before as well, which kind of disappeared, fluttered away.
Nice.
You know, the whole kind of like your lighting tests kind of looking weird or just odd out of context.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to see a pattern here. So we got the abstract derangement for composition exercise. So those kind of tests the diffuse derangement?
They are. Every single exercise I've made to do is a little bit deranged, I think, personally. It's all just an elaborate ruse to make me look weird.
With exposure being a power law factor, so every time we double the output, the brightness increases by 1 f-stop.
Yeah.
So that means that your dimmer control has got a limited range in how many stops it can reduce the brightness, the exposure.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because, like, for example, if I start as my middle ground being 50%, I have one increment I can move down and up. That's it. Got 25. Oh, 2 increments. I would need to double. Yeah, I have a number of increments I can move down. Like I've got 25, and then 12.5, which is going to be quite rough, and then whatever half of 12.5 is 6.25. But once I start moving up,
remember we're cinematographers, we're not scientists, so we treat numbers as special rather than absolute.
Yes, numbers are just silly little things that we use. They're not like maths or anything. But once I start moving up, I'm done for. Like if I start my middle ground being 50, I go to 100 and that's it. That's +1. That's all.
Here's the thing. As a little helper, initially it may be complicating things, but if you can remember this, remember there is the number 100 is both in the ISO and the foot candle sequence and in the shutter speed sequence.
What do you mean?
As in, you can have 100, 100, 2.8. The actual number 100 appears both in the foot candle column and the ISO column.
Yeah.
1/100th of a second is shutter speed.
Yeah.
The next faster shutter speed from 1/100 is 1/125. Same as the next ISO number in thirds up from 100 is 125.
And does shutter speed work in the same way, where like 1/200th of a second is one stop lower than 1/100th of a second?
Yes.
So I could, like we've spoken about this before, I could fudge it and experiment with shutter speed instead.
However, the point here isn't whether we are talking about foot candles, illumination, whether we're talking ISOs, whether we're talking shutter speed. It's the fact that the exact same numbers appear in all these different columns.
Yeah.
So, like from 100 foot candles, 1/3 more brightness is 125 foot candles.
Mm-hmm.
So remember that number sequence that we memorized last episode?
Yeah.
Everything fits into that.
Excellent. Hence, I can kind of swap things in and out if I want to do the over-under test.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Now, there are practical limitations, but in theory, what's full output on your dimming?
In theory, I mean, like the full output is 100%.
Stop right there. So the number 100 also exists in dimming percentages.
Okay, so I can use those increments.
Now, in theory.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, most dimmers are set up to show you a percentage in input power. They're not set up to show you output luminosity.
Right.
But what I'm driving at is because of that number sequence, we have a shorthand. Every time you multiply one of these numbers by 10, you increase by 3 1/3 of a stop. Every time you divide by 10, you reduce light intensity by 3 1/3 of a stop.
Okay, so I could do an over-under test where I start at 5% dimmer and then bump it up to 50 and then actually, hang on.
Where I'm going with this is more like that dimmer isn't as useful as you think it is in terms of exposure over under tests. Because if we look at it, then realistically, the lowest you're going to go is 1%.
Yeah.
Right. So 1% compared to 100 is divide by 10 twice.
Yeah.
100 divided by 10 is 10. So we've divided by 10 once. 10 divided by 10 is 1. So we divided by 10 twice.
So we've gone down by 6 and 2/3 stops.
So if you want to go 5 over and 5 under, that isn't going to give you enough range by doing it purely on dimming the light source.
Yeah. Damn. So I'll stick with f-stop as usual, and then fudge it with shutter speed as well.
But I do think that little number sequence is very handy to have up your sleeve. So, for example, if I want 10 stops more for whatever reason, I would need to increase the amount of light. Let's say we start with redhead. So let's say like we started with the 150 watts, right?
Yeah.
If I wanted 10 stops more of light, I would need 1,000 more.
Yes. Sorry, I'm getting messed up by the numbers, but it's kind of working out a little bit.
I think in that regard, like it's useful because 10 stops doesn't sound like that much, but when that means going from 150 watts to 150,000 watts, then you suddenly realize that every stop of increase in exposure comes at a cost.
Yes.
So 10 stops.
Electrical bill.
Now, like this does sound like preposterous, but for our over-under test, if we want +5, -5, then we are going to need 10 stops, right?
Yeah. It sounds to me like my solution to simply do more over-under tests. It's the one thing that I simply don't. It's the one exercise that I still kind of dread doing. So as a part of my exposure confidence training, I need to start getting used to doing those more often, maybe once a fortnight.
I think the other one as well is this is less of a kind of strict laboratory style, like build a library style thing, but just to get that feeling of what does exposures over and under correct feel like? In stills photography, particularly landscape photography, when photographers are uncertain about their exposure, they do something called bracketing their exposures.
Go on.
So have you heard of bracket targeting or targeting brackets?
I don't think so. I'm not No. Let's just say no.
Or have you heard of ranging shots?
No. I'm not a gunnery or artillery expert.
Even if you get your direction spot on, you can still hit short or long. Somewhere in the middle, you should be able to hit your target, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not hitting, and then a few shots longer, and then hopefully you'll meet that in the middle. So if your target is here, can you see a shorter exposure, a shorter distance? Looks like a bracket on one side.
Yep.
And there's another bracket, and there's another bracket, and then on the other side you got brackets going further away.
And what you're doing right now looks an awful lot like an exposure reader on a camera.
Exactly. So the exposure bracketing is, here's where I think I should expose, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm also going to shoot a few this way and a few this way. Over. Or whatever. Okay. Like probably the most common photography brackets are like three brackets either side.
That makes so much sense. Part of my brain is always like, oh, how do photographers get correct exposure all the time? That's probably what they're doing.
Part of the reason why it's not common in cinematography is that we can't do that, because by the time you've adjusted the exposure for the next bracket, time has passed. So bracketing isn't feasible or practical in real time. But in terms of building that vision, building that eye, building that library, it can be useful and for testing. So I think a useful exercise here is to pick yourself a time of day. That's probably the best place to start. Then pick an exposure as a guess, and then do brackets, maybe 2 stops either side.
Okay, I shall do that. That'll be I need to
point your camera different direction, pick a different time of day. Eventually, try and build up into actual mood and tone. Mm-hmm. Somber, happy, elated. Do the same.
So if we're going to exercisify the bracketing thing, it almost kind of sounds like over under light, almost, bear with me, minute stake over under.
Yeah,
we've minute stakeified the over under test.
That does go with it, because I think of it now, like I've started thinking of it as right exposure as the hard stop versus the correct stop. How should this feel as opposed to how should it measure? Okay, so we'll add it to our retinue of exercises with like nonsense names. So number 1, abstract derangement minute stake. Number 2, see in glass minute stake. Number 3, heart stopper minute stake. Bam. And like out of context, none of those things make any sense. I do have a question about the heart stopper minute stake now. TM, what exposure measurement should I be using to bracket with? In an ideal world, this probably is going to make it less minute stake, but in an ideal world, for actual production, then your light control should really be your exposure.
Right.
But that takes away some of the speed, and spontaneity that's going to build that mental library.
But let's say in the minute stake circumstances where I'm simply walking into my backyard at like 5 p.m. and taking a photo at like what I think is correct exposure, and then three up, 3 down. Which do you think is the best increments for the minute stake version of that?
At full stops.
Oh yeah, but like ISO or f-stop?
Probably stop, I'd say.
All right.
So yeah.
I'm so excited we have a new minute stake. This is so exciting. Whenever we have a new minute stake, I am revitalized as a human being.
I think what I would do would be to go measure the light, then decide for the time of day or mood or tone that I'm aiming for, which do I think would be right exposure away from that. So maybe +1, maybe -1, or whichever.
Which of these looks best? And then have a look at the light meter. Like have a look at the exposure meter in the camera.
So start with like the actual light meter, and let's say I'm going to go for dusk. I think dusk could look good at -1.
Okay, gotcha.
So then I'm going to do my middle exposure at -1. I'm going to do a +1 and a +2. Sorry, so that would be a -1 and that would be correct and a +1 if I started my middle as -1. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then a -3 and a -4. So relative to my starting point, do +1 and +2, and do -1 and -2.
And if your starting point is -1, then you're doing -2, -3, and +0, +1, basically.
Yes, correct.
This is sounding to me like a new creature altogether. I have a few trademark name suggestions to pitch to you, if you're ready.
Okay.
Okay. This sounds to me, right, as this is all going, obviously I was listening, but this has all been turning over my head while you were talking. Not blocking anything out, just turning over my head.
Get on with it.
Okay, this sounds a lot more like a 10-minute steak. And when you cook a steak for 10 minutes, normally you get medium rare. So this is a medium rare steak, and a minute steak is a rare steak, or a
Steak
medium
through
rare
the
10-minute
heart.
steak.
It's the vampire exercise.
It's the vampire. Guys, do you think it would catch on if we called this ramping exercise the vampire heart stopper medium rare steak 10-minute exercise? Do you think that would the vampire steak through the heart stopper medium rare 10-minute steak heart 10-minute ramping 10-minute bracket minute steak 10-minute steak rare vampire heart stopper steak exercise?
Thought one of us was on the schedule today.
That's a good. Yeah, right. Okay. Yep. What else? What else is on the menu if we're serving all the steaks?
Like I said, there are two sides to it. Like one is the constant subject.
Yeah.
And we do want some variety in subject brightness. So you want some dark subjects, you want some bright subjects in that test scene.
Yeah.
And then do the regular over-under for that one. And then I'm lazy, so I'm not going to go with the full trademarked option.
Telling me you didn't memorize that name?
Sorry, what was that?
You're telling me you didn't memorize that name?
Yeah, like a steak through the heart.
Like a steak through the heart. Okay, right. People are definitely going to remember that. That's great.
So the heart staker. On the other hand,
the heart staker, okay, which is our bracketing exercise. Measure the light, choose a stop that you think is appropriate for the mood or the time you're trying to capture. Take a photo at that stop, take a photo one stop under, another stop under, one stop above, another stop above. Hence 10-minute steak, hence heart staker, because it's a steak through the heart and a vampire, obviously. Have you ever seen that Pepsi? The digressions are hard in this episode. This is the digressing episode. Okay, so this has been a pretty hard. Let me summarize. Okay, you're just leaving little digression breadcrumbs everywhere for me to like get lost with. It's you're doing this
on this steak.
This is not my fault at all. Okay, I asked you at the start of this episode, how do I develop my confidence in exposure? Exposing to the heart, the emotion, particularly dark, particularly bright. How do I get confidence in doing that as someone who generally relies on recoverability instead? And our solution was pretty quick. And we're talking about how we get to that solution. The solution is to have a library of tested, controlled images of different exposures, which is what you get doing my least favorite test of all time, the over-under test, which sounds like I have to do more of.
Judge dread of testing.
The judge dread of testing, the judge, jury, and executioner of testing, the Sly Stallone of testing, the Alex Garland screenplay of testing, the Carl Urban of testing. Anyway, God, we've got our over-under library. That sounds pretty vital to me. Going to join the abstract derangement library, probably grow a bit slower, but alas. And in that library, we have a sort of the idea of a consistency of subject, but also a variety of subjects. Like we want a large number of consistent subjects for reference. And once you hit that point, maybe flip things around and get a large number of consistent images of a different subject. So you get variety and you see how these things change and affect people. Sounding more and more like a long-term plan. However, I will probably not have much luck doing over-under tests with my light dimmer at any point. So I'll probably be using mostly f-stop and ISO for that. And then naturally, because I'm really impatient and need instant gratification, we figured out a new 10-minute steak called the Heart Staker, obviously. The steak through the harder, the mini Judge Dredd, the inferior Sly Stallone adaptation version. If if the over-under test is the Carl Urban, Alex Garland exercise, then the bracket exercise, the heart staker, is the Sly Stallone.
Just waiting to see where he's going to end up. I really don't know at the moment.
Okay, so obviously, if this, Jesus, what is this episode? This is going to be, anyway. Obviously, this makes sense. If the over/under test is, I'm only doing this because I have 7 minutes left on my schedule. If the over/under test is the judge, jury, and executioner, and therefore Judge Dredd, of which there has been 2 adaptations, and also the superior way of getting your exposure library, which Judge Dredd movie is a superior movie? The Alex Garland written one, I can't remember who directed it. The Alex Garland one with Carl Urban. However, if you want something that just does the trick, you can watch the Sly Stallone adaptation instead. That just does the trick, doesn't it? And you know what else does the trick? The heart staker. That does the trick. That builds your library, but it isn't quite as good like a Sly Stallone adaptation. What do you think of that?
Let me consult my legal team. Broadcast legal, that is. What did you think?
Broadcast legal.
Hopefully the benefit of the heart staker, which, by the way, isn't a tried and tested exercise yet.
Yep, the testing phase begins now.
So this is kind of, Ethan's volunteered himself as the lab rat, the hamster for the heart staker. So hopefully what that is going to do over the traditional over-under is it's going to give you a sense of a more of a variety of environments and scene brightness ranges.
Yeah.
So that we start kind of seeing the light level as opposed to the image brightness, because the image brightness is so dictated by how bright are the subjects, the objects, the mise-en-scène to start with. So for the same amount of light, for the same camera exposure settings, an image may appear a little brighter because it's got brighter objects, it's got brighter subjects.
Here's the plan. I've already got a few things on my line up already. So tomorrow I'll be doing an exercise from the episode that we just did, which is our little shape of light situation. I'll do something for that. But tomorrow I'll also get a heart staker to you. So there's my 2 tasks for tomorrow. Tomorrow being the 21st of April. By the 21st of April, you will have a heart staker and a shape of light exercise, which I'll probably have to rewatch the recording to figure out exactly what I'm doing for that. And expect a Sly Stallone Judge Dredd heart staker by tomorrow.
Hang on, was that Sly or Slice?
Sly. Okay. We're not making this even worse. A Sylvester Stallone Judge Dredd heart staker by tomorrow. I will post it probably before I post the other exercise. And then the next week I'll do a proper over-under test. Next week being the 28th of April. I put that in my to-do list now. Another well-rounded conclusion, I think, personally.
Excellent.
While I've still got you,
yep.
Do we want to figure out what exactly it is that I actually am doing with the shape of light exercise? Right. Okay. I wanted to test the difference between height and width.
Yep.
Taking a photo of myself with a specific light pattern of my choice with my source horizontally and vertically, and seeing what the difference is.
Mm-hmm. And the other one was to go with the portrait orientation, but cover half the height.
I'll think about that one because I'm not sure how I'm going to pull it off because I haven't got much to actually cut my source with.
Towels, black bed sheets.
Towels, black bed sheets. I might be messaging you about that one for a bit of specifics later on, but.
So, did we do a bearded soft source?
Bearded. Oh, is it the one that kind of runs?
So, if you imagine like a diffusion frame, so you know how you get that annoying leak of hard light under the bottom of it?
Yeah.
So, clip a piece of fabric to the bottom, it just hangs loose from there. Yeah. So, if you want to do that to the half height, you can just clip it up halfway up rather than to the bottom. So, you know, your binder clips, your bolt back clips, or whatever.
Okay. I'll add that to my plus. Bearded source on tall source half height. Okay, cool. Excellent.
So yeah, I think eventually longer term, you want to start thinking about like, rather than just reducing the size of the source, thinking more about the shaping of it by using the toppers, bottomers, siders. So the big difference between toppers, bottomers, and siders, and like something that you cut directly up the source is the distance between the cutter and the source, so that you get more of a hint of shape in the shaping. So part of the reason why window light source feels so specific is that the window isn't the source. The environment outside is the source.
Yeah, and the window's cutting it.
And the window acts as a cutter, so that puts the cutter a lot closer to the subject than the source.
Yeah. I had so many things I had not even thought of. Okay, for now, I'll just do the laying the beard flat on them.
Interesting thing with a window light source is that as you move closer at a certain point, it rapidly expands to a much bigger source.
Oh.
Because as you're close to the window, you start being able to see much more of the outside.
Like the porthole, like the synthesized.
So that's kind of why I'm saying, like,
allegory.
Beginner mistake is to thinking like a window is the size of the window.
Yeah.
But it's actually the source is the size of whatever is visible outside.
Which depends on how close the subject is. So you need to... What's a way of calculating that? I mean, I'm sure there is, but it's pretty really messed up and evil and complicated.